The World Health Organization is warning of future global pandemics, and it's pressing member nations, including the U.S., to sign on to a treaty giving the organization broader authority. But as Lori Johnson reports, the WHO's questionable decision-making during COVID is raising some red flags.
Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. He's the Director General of the World Health Organization. Dr. Ghebreyesus has the most important job in the world right now. His agency is in charge of the global response to the coronavirus pandemic.
During my visit to Beijing last week, I was so impressed in my meeting with President Xi at his detailed knowledge of the outbreak and for his personal leadership, but also at his commitment from the words he told me I will share with you. We will take serious measures at the epicenter, at the source, in order to protect our people and also to prevent the spread of the virus to other countries.
Let's have a quick look at just some of the absolute massive missteps from the World Health Organization. In December, as China arrested whistleblower doctors and ordered labs to destroy evidence, the WHO did nothing. Indeed, the WHO refused to listen to Taiwanese authorities about the disease's spread and the risk of human-to-human transmission. Some weeks later, in mid-January, the WHO was still spreading China's lies that there was no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission. A week later, Beijing banned travel from the coronavirus epicenter to the rest of China, but allowed travel from that region to the rest of the world. Again, the WHO did nothing as China allowed the virus to spread far and wide. When Australia and the US imposed travel bans against China in late January, they did so against the WHO's advice. Indeed, in February, the WHO chief said that such travel bans would increase fear and stigma with little public health benefit. And he praised China's transparency while claiming the virus's spread was minimal and slow. That dodgy advice from the WHO continued in March, when the Director General said COVID-19 spreads less efficiently than flu. Transmission does not appear to be driven by people who are not sick. And they failed to declare a pandemic until March 11. And who can forget when the WHO chief threatened to send more body bags to the nations who criticised their handling of this pandemic.
The development of safe and effective vaccines less than a year after the emergence of this novel coronavirus is a stunning scientific achievement.
The Queen of Denmark has tested positive to COVID shortly after attending Queen Elizabeth's funeral in London. It's the second positive diagnosis for Queen Margrethe, who also contracted the virus in February, despite 3 vaccines for COVID.
95% effectiveness.
2 doses of this vaccine is the greatest protection that you can have.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison has revealed he's tested positive to COVID.
I've taken a test that has come out positive.
You deserve the freedom to be safe from COVID-19.
This would be the second time the Prime Minister has tested positive.
What we're seeing at the moment, we had the report in the 9 newspapers yesterday and the day before about the effect that lockdowns had and school closures are having on children, the effects that are being seen with isolation, then falling behind in not just their education, but also just basic social skills and the mental health impacts that all that is having. That's all coming out. We're seeing slowly more reports coming out on vaccine injuries. There is a report today in the Daily Telegraph on COVID-19 vaccine injuries. And the WA Health Department, I wrote about this on Sky News as well. The WA Health Department has a document about adverse vaccine reactions, whereas pericarditis and myocarditis, Guillain-Barré and Bell's palsy all spiked coincidentally, when the vaccine mandates were introduced.
The pandemic treaty is that controversial blueprint for how the WHO and the international community will deal with future pandemics. Critics argue this treaty gives too much power to too few and could threaten our basic freedoms.
That the WHO has the ability to say what is disinformation. And when anybody says to you that the science is settled on any issue, I suggest that this House would smell a rat straight away, because science is never settled. There is always open for modification, for new things to be discovered, theses to be refined. And what the WHO is saying is that the WHO will be the arbiter of what the science is. And that cannot be right. It's a bit like someone saying the market's changed. Well, in my experience, it never has. So that is a huge grab of power. And the two instruments, the pandemic treaty and the amendments to the international health regulations, are progressing in parallel. And for those who, I just really worry whether colleagues in this have actually read the treaty, because clearly, you know, when you take out the words "not binding" as an amendment, it then becomes binding. You know, these are binding treaties. If we do nothing, these treaties are binding. They're legally binding across all the nations. They're bringing in an idea called One Health. So, and this then extends the ability of the Director General of the WHO to call a public health emergency of international concern, which incidentally is abbreviated to FAKE. So, and it says that he can bring it in on the suspicion, the risk of an international incident. It doesn't even have to be about a pathogen that's affecting humans. It can affect animals. He's taking the powers because of the environment, or an increase in the levels of CO2. I suggest that honourable and right honourable members read the treaty. It's a massive extension of powers, and at the drop of a hat, one man, Mr. Tedros, can call for massive powers to the WHO. And not only will he call when he takes the powers, he will decide when the pandemic or the emergency is over, and when he'll possibly give us the powers back to this House, where elected representatives are supposed to be representing the interests of our constituents. Well, that will all be suspended. And I would, while we're talking about Mr. Tedros, I mean, I would just remind the House that this gentleman who will be deciding the fate of the world, it'll be within his gift to call these emergencies. The conduct of the WHO in the recent Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 83 individuals who are working for the WHO sexually abused local women, and including the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl. And it was all covered up, Mr. Sharma. And in a leaked document from the WHO, which would have been in front of Mr. Tedros's committee, a confidential UN report submitted to the WHO last month concluded that the manager's handling of the case didn't violate WHO sexual exploitation policies because the woman concerned was not a beneficiary of WHO aid since she didn't receive any humanitarian support. That is completely unacceptable. If that's the rules of an organisation that will be deciding whether my constituents are locked down for 6 months, 3 months, and whether they can go and see their granny, I don't think it's acceptable. Also, these new treaties, they compress the time for governments of mandatory reporting lines of 72 hours from when a risk to public health has to be reported to the WHO, and he'll make a decision. This is far too little time for any research, any meaningful research to be done as to what the real risk is, and it will lead to lots of potential for false alarms and unnecessary disruption. These are huge powers that these two instruments would seek to take away from this Parliament and every other Parliament around the world, and they need to be considered very, very strongly. Sticking your head in the sand isn't going to do. It won't do for my constituents. You know, if we learn anything from the vote we had in 2016, is that people in this country, they do not want to be ruled by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. And there's no one more unaccountable and unelected of people in the WHO who don't pay tax, and they and their families have immunity from prosecution because they've got diplomatic immunity. They're also under the huge financial interests of whoever wishes to fund them. So many experts are now saying that these two instruments would fundamentally reset the relationship between citizens and sovereign states, not in this country, but also around the whole world. Unelected, unaccountable, top-down, supranational body, the WHO. What these treaties will do will empower that Director General to impose sweeping, legally binding, they are legally binding directions on member states. They'll be forced, they have the power then to force companies in this country or any other country to manufacture certain medical treatments and to export them to other countries and be told to do it. It'll have the power to shut down any business in this country, regardless of what the local people think or even this Parliament. It takes away all the protections that being in a democracy offers. It actually takes away Article 3 in the original Constitution, which is the respect of human right and dignity. That goes and is replaced by a bland statement saying that there will be equity. And equity means whatever it means. It means that everyone's going to be treated equally. It also means that one solution to any international problem around the world. And that leads to an all-or-nothing situation, Mr. Sharma, where if the WHO got it right, and if we want to go in, if I have the time, I'll go into everything they got wrong in the last pandemic. If they get it right, okay, maybe okay. But if they get it wrong, that's the whole of humanity has got it wrong. There's no competition, and if there was only one car manufacturer, only one solution, I'm not sure it would be the best car that we could ever have. I think competition between nations for solutions is a good thing. I have grave concerns over these two instruments.
The powers for the WHO extend potentially to ordering border closures on countries, travel restrictions, tracing of contacts, refusal of entry, forced quarantining, medical examinations, including requirements for proof of vaccination, and even the forced medication of individuals. And it's not just when there is indeed a pandemic already declared that these powers might be invoked, it's when there is simply the potential for such an emergency that the WHO claims this power.
And of course, they throw misinformation bit in there too. Here's their sort of summary of all the things they want to do. Look at E, they want to counter misinformation and disinformation. That information bit is important because the pandemic powers, the document that we can opt into that we've been talking about, they've defined a risk now, a new risk. We talked about this before. In the draft that we talked about in February, it said infodemic defined as ... So we never knew exactly how they were going to define infodemic. We just knew that they wanted to. Now they have. Take a look. I just highlighted it as how they're defining an infodemic. They're saying it's a new health threat. With this new information ecosystem has generated a new health threat called an infodemic. It is the overabundance of information, accurate or not. Let's all digest that for a second, because you can have an overabundance of truth, you guys, and that's bad for you. We can see how they have been working, especially during the pandemic. They didn't have checks on their power. They didn't have any, we weren't given any opportunity to give feedback. We weren't given any opportunity to vote. They approve who they want. In fact, they promote people who have been good soldiers of COVIDism. We spoke about the guy who was able to provide edits to the Nature journal that disproved the COVID lab leak. He was promoted inside the World Health Organization, and he worked with Dr. Fauci, and he basically wrote in foregone conclusions to a scientific paper about how COVID did not come from a lab, which was later refuted by military doctors. So we see this behavior. I don't think we're going to see like real democracy functioning inside of this. It's not possible that way.
It's not possible. When they're, as Philip pointed out earlier, when they're unaccountable, it's not possible. And so that's why you write a constitution. So you have checks and balances. You have a Supreme Court. You have a bicameral government that keeps each other in check.
And this is how you blow up a constitution, is you just take it and usurp it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The WHO refuses to call the pandemic treaty a treaty. It calls it an agreement, an accord, a framework, anything else, likely because it does not want it to be submitted to the treaty process in the United States and worldwide.